In early February 2003, U.S. Army shot down a Chinese surveillance balloon off the coast of South Carolina. The reaction of China was very angry. A Chinese spokesman accused Washington of regularly dropping spy balloons over Chinese territory, saying the United States should self-reflect and change course instead of smearing and instigating confrontation. This tit-for-tat response is becoming increasingly common as China's power grows. In areas such as international trade, human rights, maritime and defense development monitoring, Beijing accuses the United States of hypocrisy and double standards and intends to respond proportionately to actions of Washington. China's allegation in each case is, in general, the same, that the United States does not comply with its own rules-based international order and therefore cannot criticize China for doing the same. China's strong reaction is risky to a country with a weaker military and fewer allies than the United States. So why do they continue to behave this way? In addition to the usual goals of security and prosperity, rising powers tend to overestimate their place in the international order. Pursuing higher status can spur nations to do things like pour billions of dollars into space programs, nuclear weapons, or big sport events. All of the above efforts, plus the strong reactions, can accomplish the goal of wanting to be treated equally and claiming their status as important. With a rising power like China, feeling unequal is unacceptable. An unestablished power bends and breaks international rules, but doesn't allow Beijing to have the same right. China wants to be recognized as an equal to the United States. In some circumstances, persistent inequality of this kind can cause a country to become hostile to the country it perceives as oppressive. China's approach to the current international order depends on the rules and how other countries recognize China's own status. Beijing tends to cooperate with institutions that put it on a par with the United States. They challenge or seek to oppose countries that do not. The sustainability of the international order, therefore, depends on whether the core principle and the architect is the United States can create enough impetus for China to cooperate. As the power in geopolitics begin to shift, emerging and established power often fall into a collision known as the Thucydides trap. According to above logic, the great powers manipulate the international order for their own benefit. The rising powers seek to share those interests which the established power are not willing to cooperate with. This is a cause that sets the stage for large-scale conflicts in many fields, greatly affecting the current international order. According to experts, if material interests are important, a rising power will be hard-pressed to challenge an order that has facilitated that rise. Reversing an international order through war and conflict is extremely costly and risky. Nations sometimes fail miserably. In some ways, the war between Russia and Ukraine also reflects this. A nation will take risks not because an order does not enrich them, but because an order always denies them something more invisible, a position worthy of respect. In the hearts of many Chinese people, a century when they were invaded and despoiled by the West, considered the sick man of East Asia, is still a haunting memory. The Peloponnesian War created the concept of the Thucydides trap, showing how anxiety about the status of a rising power could cause or exacerbate conflict. The ancient Greek historian Thucydides, telling about the war, suggested that Sparta's fear of a rising Athens led to hostilities. Athens, for its part, resented the criticism it received from Sparta about the expansion of its imperialism. After all, this is what all the great powers have done, and the Spartan stance seems hypocritical. According to Athenians, none of the critics question why this charge was not made against other empires, whose treatment of their people was even more brutal. The rise of Athens may have caused fear in Sparta, but Athens' refusal to back down was due to status anxiety and feelings of being unfairly treated. The truth is great powers manipulate the international order in their favor, but the focus is on the established powers that want to maintain a privileged position as a rule maker. The purpose of the organizations created by the great powers in history, such as the European Union, the Executive Council of the League of Nations, or the United Nations Security Council, is to strengthen their prerogatives while still regulating the behaviors of other countries. Rising nations with growing power seek to join the club of great powers to gain other status. The real tragedy between the great powers lies in the fact that the rising nations try to change the order for more advantage, but the established powers want to stay the same. Status is a scarce commodity, its value decreasing as more nations own it. Consequently, the international order is often not positioned to accommodate the rise of new powers. However, this doesn't mean that cooperation and peaceful trends are difficult to achieve. At the end of 19th century, America challenged British imperial hegemony. Decades of strained relations following Britain intervention in the American Civil War. London made significant concessions in the Treaty of Washington in 1871, which marked the beginning of the special relationship between the two countries. The rising powers are also not fundamentally inclined to conflict, often cooperating or trying to improve the old international order, for example, trying to acquire more allies to improve the image on the international stage. Even the way of getting more allies is controversial. China's policy in Africa, using investment money, aid, and loans to create debt traps, forcing many countries to support them in international conferences. Many psychosocial studies show that groups of people cooperate better in a hierarchy open enough to advance plus fair and transparent rules. The international order works in a similar way. The set of rules must be transparent, no double standards or no discrimination. Rising powers see the openness and fairness of the institutions to measure their place in international order. The openness of an organization can easily be understood in terms of people who aspire to become leaders in that organization. For example, the International Monetary Fund is a more open institution than the UN Security Council because IMF rules by voting rights on important policies to each country's economic power, while the United Nations Security Council does not accept new permanent members. The five-member decide nearly every global issue. Some argue that international organizations do not favor great powers arbitrarily, nor should a rising power be viewed as inferior to the established powers. According to this explanation, the UN General Assembly's one country, one vote system is somewhat more equitable than the Security Council's veto system with five permanent members. In short, openness and fairness will determine whether the current order can meet the aspirations of a rising power like China's status. Perhaps China itself can answer. It's not only related to the external environment, but the key factor is the internal drive and ambitions of this Asian superpower. China is not simply accepting or rejecting the current international order. China is more cooperative in multilateral organizations that it considers open and fair. On the other hand, China rejects or challenges mechanisms it considers unfair. China also seeks to improve institutions it thinks are partially fair. China tends to judge organizations based on whether they see Beijing as equals with Washington and other great powers such as France and Great Britain. The United Nations Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly, the World Trade Organization, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the G20 are institutions that seem to be open to the role of China. The Asian superpower is one of the five permanent veto members of the Security Council. These five countries also form the Club of Nuclear Powers. In the policy of the global non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, China's economic strength helping them to be appreciated in the WTO and G20. Terms on Security Council veto power, UN General Assembly voting procedures, WTO dispute settlement mechanism, rotating leadership as well as G20 consensus decision, making these institutions procedurally fair from the Chinese point of view. As a result, China mainly cooperates with them, although it increasingly puts its own interests above the common goals. Following this trend, China, like the United States, has sometimes broken the rules it expects other partners to follow. On the other hand, China has opposed the United Nations human rights agencies, most notably the former United Nations Human Rights Commissions and its successor, the United Nations Human Rights Council. The United States and its allies have repeatedly used this aspect of the international order to condemn China. As a result, China has a limited leadership role in these organizations, which are largely controlled by Western democracies. China views criticism directed at itself as a denial of its legitimacy, especially when looking at the United States' global human rights record. That's why China is uncooperative, often dismissing Western demands for human rights. China has even begun to follow the West, issuing annual reports on human rights abused by the United States. In institutions that are only open or partially fair from China's perspective, Beijing seeks to improve to enhance its position. For example, the IMF and the World Bank, where China has promoted more openness about voting rights. However, China is somewhat disappointed by the slow pace of reform. In response, they created and support new institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where they act as the de facto leader. Likewise, in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, China advocates for a more equitable distribution of responsibility for addressing global warming, so that advanced economies' Western progress must be held accountable for their historic contributions to this growing disaster. Since 2005, China has been the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but China also wants Western countries to be held accountable for their hundreds of years of industrialization. China's approach suggests that the period of power shifts in global politics largely depends on the extent to which the rising powers consider themselves equal to established powers. Historically, rising powers include the United States in the 19th century have increasingly cooperated in international system to give them a place at the global negotiating table. On the contrary, aggression and defiance of the rules are the cause of conflicts. The United States may be reviewing its lesson in keeping the fundamentals of the current order. In institutions where China's status is guaranteed, the United States should demand more from the Asian nation. For example, China should be co-China to play a greater role in peacemaking in Ukraine, make a more effort to maintain WTO accession commitments, especially to stop unfair trade policies as well as to protect intellectual property rights, or cooperate to put pressure on North Korea over its nuclear program. Washington is better positioned to make these demands. If China wants its status to be elevated, it's likely to shoulder some of the work. In return, institutions that China consider unequal, the United States should also consider reform. In the IMF and the World Bank, the United States can change to give developing countries a greater voice. Washington can also accept leaders of key sections of these organizations from developing countries. It also makes the Asia and Africa agenda easier. President Joe Biden recently nominated Mr. Ajay Banga, a business leader from India, to be the president of World Bank. The move was welcomed by developing countries. It's likely that in the near future, more of the World Bank's fund will go to climate change projects in Asia and Africa. All of this will enhance the openness and fairness of the international order, creating an impetus for China to cooperate on more issues. The division between China and the United States on some issues such as human rights, the future of the Taiwan Islands, or the South China Sea Corridor certainly cannot be resolved in one day. Throughout history, Chinese feudal dynasties have always considered territorial expansion as one of their priorities. Overall, however, the current international order can be adjusted to minimize conflict between the two countries. In international politics, any country feels uncomfortable when there is pressure from outside, especially with the conditions imposed. As the global distribution of power shifts, the question arises not only of who will make the rules, but also who will be breaking them with impunity. That's why rules-making and hypocrisy go hand in hand when viewing conflict management and international cooperation. According to experts, China's ultimate goal is to have the same double standard as the United States. For example, calling for respect for territorial sovereignty in one place but invading another country, or encouraging secession in another place. This may not be a simple problem. It depends on how strong China's wishes are, whether it surpasses the limits of the United States and its allies. Our program has come to an end now. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.